On a crisp Chicago morning, she stepped into the gleaming, modern office of Apex Dynamics, her first day as an intern, her eyes alight with ambition that seemed to pulse like a quiet fire beneath her composed exterior. Her posture radiated a determination so subtle, yet undeniable that it seemed to hum in the air around her, current waiting to surge at just the right moment. He, the smug CEO, caught sight of her from across the open-plan office, his sharp eyes scanning the room for a target, a chance to assert his dominance. He decided to make a move not out of interest, not out of genuine curiosity about the new face in his domain, but to flex his power in front of his team. To remind everyone who held the reins in this glass-walled kingdom where egos clashed and hierarchies were ruthlessly enforced. "Hey, sweetheart, stick with me and you'll go places," he smirked, his voice booming across the office, cutting through the hum of keyboards, the rustle of papers. In the muted conversations of employees who knew better than to challenge him, their heads bowed over their work. They froze, colleagues and junior staff alike, their heads turning, their breaths catching, sensing the tension that crackled in the air like static before a storm, a moment that felt like it could ignite or dissolve in an instant. But she just smiled, calm and unshaken, her expression betraying nothing but a faint, almost amused glint in her eyes. A glint that hinted at something deeper, something hidden, like a card held close to the chest in a high-stakes game. Why didn't she flinch? Why didn't she shrink under the weight of his words, the way most would have, the way most interns did in the face of his overbearing presence? Because she held a secret. A truth so explosive, it would turn his world upside down by the end of the day, leaving his carefully constructed empire trembling on its foundations. Her name was Nia Carter, and she wasn't just another face in the crowd, another intern to be dismissed or toyed with. She was a force, a quiet storm waiting to unravel everything he thought he controlled. A young woman who carried herself with the kind of poise that made you wonder what she knew that you didn't. What unseen power she wielded behind her serene facade. At 22, Nia was a recent NYU graduate. Her quiet confidence, a beacon that didn't scream for attention but demanded it nonetheless. A presence that seemed to shift the air around her without effort, like a melody that lingers long after the music stops. Her dark curls framed a face that carried both determination and a hint of mystery, like someone who'd seen enough of the world to know its games, its power plays, its unspoken rules, yet hadn't let it harden her, hadn't let it dim the fire in her eyes that burned with purpose. She'd landed an internship at Apex Dynamics, a tech firm nestled in the heart of Chicago's Loop, a place notorious for its cutthroat culture, its relentless pace, and its flashy CEO, Ethan Caldwell. At 38, he was charming when it suited his agenda. His smile, a calculated tool to win allies or disarm critics. But he was infamous for treating the office like his personal stage, a theater where he was the star, the director, the entire show. And everyone else was relegated to the role of an extra, their voices muted, their presence incidental. They whispered about him in the break room, their voices low, their eyes darting to the door to ensure he wasn't nearby how he'd built. Apex, from a scrappy startup in a cramped garage to a tech powerhouse with a gleaming high-rise office, its glass walls reflecting the ambition and arrogance of its leader. They spoke of his ego, bigger than the company's valuation, a force that seemed to dwarf even the most significant achievements. They murmured about his love for the spotlight, how he basked in it like it was his birthright. His tailored suits always a shade too flashy, his slicked back hair a perfect frame for his performative grin, his loud laugh a demand for an audience that never failed to materialize. It was all part of the performance, a carefully curated act designed to keep everyone in their place, to ensure that no one forgot who held the power, who wrote the script, who decided the ending. He wasn't just running a company, he was playing a role, and he expected everyone to clap, to nod along, to play their parts in his meticulously staged production, whether they wanted to or not. Their own ambitions secondary to his need for control, Nia's first day unfolded like any other intern's, a whirlwind of mundane tasks that felt designed to test her patience. to remind her of her place at the bottom of the corporate hierarchy, a cog in a machine that valued obedience over initiative. She was handed a towering stack of paperwork to file, sent on coffee runs for senior staff who barely acknowledged her existence, their eyes fixed on their screens or their own egos, and tasked with navigating the maze of glass-walled offices that made up Apex's headquarters, a labyrinth of transparency that somehow felt opaque, hiding more than it revealed, its polished surfaces reflecting ambition but concealing the tensions beneath. She kept her head down, but not out of submission. Her focus was razor-sharp. Her notebook, a canvas of meticulous observations about workflows, client names, project deadlines, and the subtle power dynamics that pulse through the office like a heartbeat, each interaction a clue to the unspoken rules that govern this world. They noticed her focus. Colleagues like Priya, a sharp-witted project manager with a knack for reading people, who could spot a lie or a hidden agenda from across a room with the precision of a hawk in Marcus. A soft-spoken coder who preferred the quiet logic of his screens to the chaos of office politics, where egos clashed like storms and alliances shifted like sand. They saw something different in her, something that set her apart from the other interns who scrambled to prove themselves, who tripped over their own eagerness to please, their voices trembling as they sought approval. She wasn't just another fresh-faced grad trying to make a mark, hoping for a pat on the back or a permanent offer that might never come. Her questions were too precise, cutting through the fluff to the core of issues. Her presence too composed for someone stuck fetching coffee or sorting files. Her demeanor suggesting a purpose that went beyond the role she'd been assigned. A depth that hinted at a plan no one else could see. Priya caught her eye during a team huddle, noting how Nia listened intently, her pen moving swiftly as she jotted down details others missed, names of key clients, discrepancies in project timelines, even the way certain managers deferred to Ethan despite their own expertise. Their voices shrinking in his presence, their confidence dimmed by his shadow. Marcus, too, noticed her knack for spotting errors in datasets, catching mistakes that senior analysts had breezed past, her red pen marking issues with a precision that bordered on surgical. Each correction, a quiet act of defiance against the carelessness around her. "She's sharp," he muttered to Priya one day over lunch, his voice low as he glanced toward Nia, who was reviewing a report at a nearby table. Her brow furrowed in concentration, her pen moving with deliberate care. "Too sharp for this place?" Priya replied, her eyes narrowing as she watched Nia's pen move with deliberate precision. Each stroke a small rebellion against the chaos that defined Apex, a testament to her refusal to be diminished. He, Ethan, strutted into the open plan office that morning, his tailored suit catching the light as he moved, the fabric gleaming like armor, his presence commanding attention like a spotlight sweeping across a stage, illuminating him and him alone, casting everyone else into the shadows. They watched as he scanned the room, always looking for an audience, always seeking a moment to shine, to remind everyone who held the reins, who decided who thrived and who faded into the background, his every step a calculated performance. His eyes landed on Naya, standing by the printer, sorting a stack of documents with a focus that seemed almost defiant in its quiet intensity, her hands moving with a steady rhythm that contrasted with the frenetic energy of the office, a calm amid the storm. She wore a simple blazer and skirt, professional but unflashy, her expression focused as she organized the chaos of papers into neat piles, her attention wholly on the task at hand, as if the world around her was secondary to her purpose. He saw an opportunity not for connection, not for mentorship, but to show off, to assert his dominance in a room full of onlookers, to remind everyone that he was the one calling the shots, the one who set the tone. "New blood, huh?" he called out, his voice carrying across the office, loud enough to pull every head in the room. From the junior devs hunched over their laptops, their code forgotten for a moment, to the marketing team huddled around a whiteboard, their markers pausing mid-stroke, their eyes drawn to the unfolding drama. They turned, some smirking, others uneasy, sensing the power play unfolding. The way Ethan's words were less about Nia and more about his own need to dominate, to remind everyone of his place at the top. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he added, leaning against a desk, his grin wide and performative. Like a showman addressing a crowd, his tone dripping with a condescension he didn't bother to mask. A tone that said he expected her to play along, to shrink, to acknowledge his authority with a nervous nod or a stammered reply. She looked up, unfazed, her eyes meeting his without a flicker of hesitation. Her posture steady, as if his words hadn't landed at all. As if they were nothing more than background noise, irrelevant to her purpose. "Nia Carter," she answered. Her tone polite but firm, no hint of intimidation. No trace of the nervous deference he was used to from interns, who often stammered or blushed under his gaze, their voices trembling as they tried to match his energy. He didn't expect that. Most interns tripped over their words to please him, to prove they belonged, their eagerness a shield against his scrutiny. Instead, she held eye contact, her smile faint but deliberate, like she was sizing him up. Reading the room in a way he couldn't, her gaze steady and unflinching, a quiet challenge wrapped in composure. They sensed the shift. Priya raised an eyebrow from her desk, her pen pausing mid-note, her lips twitching with curiosity, a spark of intrigue in her eyes. Marcus froze mid-code, his fingers hovering over the keyboard as he watched the exchange, his brow furrowing slightly, sensing something deeper at play. Ethan, undeterred, pushed further, his voice thick with arrogance, his words a calculated attempt to put her in her place, to remind her and everyone else who held the power. "Stick with me, Nia, and you'll go places." "I run a tight ship," he said, his grin widening, his tone a mix of charm and condescension, a power play disguised as mentorship, a way to mark his territory in front of the team, to remind everyone that he was the one who decided who rose and who fell, who mattered and who didn't. The room grew quiet, the air thick with secondhand embarrassment as they waited for her reaction, expecting her to shrink, to nod along, to play the part of the eager intern who knew her place, who understood the unspoken rules of this game. She didn't blush or look away, didn't give him the reaction he expected, the deference he craved. Instead, she nodded, almost amused, her lips curving into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. A smile that carried a hint of something sharper, something knowing, like she saw through his act and wasn't impressed. "I'm here to learn." "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice steady, each word measured and deliberate, like she'd rehearsed it in her head 1,000 times. Like she'd faced men like him before and knew exactly how to handle them, how to turn their own weapons against them without raising her voice. Her response was too smooth, too controlled, a quiet challenge wrapped in politeness that caught him off guard. He blinked, thrown off by her calm, his grin faltering for a split second before he recovered with a loud laugh, turning to his team as if they were all in on the joke, as if her composure was something to be mocked rather than respected, a quirk to be tamed. "See? Fresh talent. We'll mold her yet," he said, his voice booming, his eyes scanning the room for approval, for the laughter he expected. They exchanged glances, unsure what to make of it, their eyes darting between Nia's composed figure and Ethan's forced bravado. The tension in the room palpable, like a string pulled taut, ready to snap. Priya leaned toward Marcus, her voice a whisper, barely audible over the hum of the office, her eyes fixed on Nia. She didn't even flinch. Marcus nodded, his eyes still on Nia, who had returned to her documents as if nothing had happened, her focus unbroken, her pen moving with the same steady precision. Why was she so calm? What did she know that he didn't? The office buzzed with unspoken questions, a tension that lingered like static in the air, a sense that something was brewing just out of sight, waiting to break. A storm, gathering strength in the quiet. He didn't let up, didn't pause to consider the weight of her response, or the way it shifted the room, the way it hinted at his strength he couldn't comprehend. Over the next week, Ethan's behavior escalated. Each interaction with Nia a chance to flex his authority in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. A performance that grew more brazen with each passing day, as if he was determined to crack her composure, to force her to bend under the weight of his presence. He'd call her out in meetings, tossing her menial tasks with a wink. "Nia, grab me a coffee, will you?" His tone light, but laced with an edge that dared her to push back, that invited her to challenge him so he could put her in her place. His words a test of her willingness to play along. He'd make offhand comments about her potential in front of clients. His words implying she was lucky to be in his orbit, that her presence was a privilege he could revoke at any moment. A gift he bestowed upon her out of his own generosity. They cringed, watching her handle it with a grace that seemed almost unnatural, a composure that felt like a shield against his barbs, deflecting them with an ease that only deepened the tension that made his efforts seem futile. She never snapped back, never gave him the reaction he seemed to crave, the flustered deference or the wounded look that would confirm his control, that would let him know he'd won the round. Instead, she'd smile, nod, and carry on. Her composure unshakable, like she was playing a game he didn't understand. Moving pieces he couldn't see, her every response, a calculated step and a plan he couldn't fathom. They started to notice patterns, how she'd redirect his jabs with sharp but polite responses. How she'd turn his attempts to belittle her into moments that highlighted her competence, her quiet strength. In one meeting, when he handed her a stack of files to organize for the grown-ups, his tone dripping with mockery, a smirk playing on his lips as he leaned back in his chair. She returned them an hour later, perfectly sorted with flagged errors he'd missed in the financial reports, errors that could have cost the company thousands if left unchecked, mistakes that spoke to his own carelessness. He laughed it off, his voice a little too loud, his eyes betraying a flicker of unease, a crack in his carefully curated facade that grew wider with each encounter. Each moment where she refused to bend, they started to talk. Their voices hushed in the break room, in the hallways. In the moments when Ethan was out of earshot, when his larger-than-life presence wasn't dominating the space, casting its shadow over their conversations. Priya pulled Nia aside one day in the break room, the hum of the coffee machine filling the silence as she stirred her tea, her eyes searching Nia's face for answers, for some clue to what made her so unshakable, so impervious to Ethan's tactics. "How do you deal with him?" she asked, her voice low but urgent, her fingers tightening around her mug, as if anchoring herself against the tension that seemed to permeate the office. "He's testing you. You know that, right? He does this to every new intern. Pushes them until they break or bow. But you're different. You don't let him get to you. Not even a little." Anaya shrugged, her eyes glinting with something Priya couldn't quite place. A mix of amusement and resolve. A spark that suggested she was playing a bigger game. One with stakes they couldn't yet see. "He's not the first to underestimate me," she said, her words hanging in the air, cryptic but heavy with meaning. Like a door cracked open just enough to hint at something vast behind it. A depth of experience that belied her age. A history of facing down challenges and emerging stronger. Marcus overheard, leaning against the counter with his protein shake. His usual quiet demeanor broken by curiosity, his eyes flicking toward Naya as she spoke, his brow furrowing as he tried to piece together the puzzle she presented. "Just watch your back," he said, his voice soft but serious, his gaze darting toward the door as if Ethan might walk in at any moment. His shadow always looming, a constant presence even in his absence. Ethan's got a way of making things personal. He doesn't like it when people don't play along with his game. When they don't fit into his script, she thanked them, her smile warm but guarded, suggesting she wasn't worried, not even a little. Her confidence a quiet defiance that left them both intrigued and unsettled. Wondering what gave her such unshakable resolve, they exchanged a look as she walked away, her heels clicking softly on the tile, her posture straight and unyielding. Like someone who knew exactly where she was going and why, someone with a destination in mind. "She's got something up her sleeve," Priya muttered, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes narrowing as she watched Nia disappear around the corner, her silhouette sharp against the fluorescent light. Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful, his mind turning over the possibilities. Or someone. He, meanwhile, was oblivious to the storm brewing, too caught up in his own narrative, his own need to be the center of attention, to see the warning signs that were mounting around him. Each interaction with Nia a crack in the foundation he thought was unshakable. Ethan thrived on control, and Nia's quiet defiance intrigued him in all the wrong ways. A puzzle he was determined to solve, a challenge he mistook for naivety. A wild horse he could tame with enough pressure, enough posturing. So, he pushed harder, his comments growing bolder, his tone more pointed, his interactions with her more frequent and more public. As if he could wear her down through sheer persistence. As if he could force her to break by doubling down on his usual tactics. During a team presentation on Wednesday, Nia was asked to share her analysis of a market trend, a rare moment for an intern. A chance to prove herself in front of the senior team. A stage most would have trembled on, their voices shaking under the weight of scrutiny. She stood at the front of the room, her slides clean and data-driven. Her voice steady as she outlined projections for Apex's new product launch. Her analysis sharp, pinpointing risks in the competitive landscape that others had overlooked. Her delivery confident but not showy, each word chosen with care. Each point backed by data that spoke louder than any bravado. He interrupted halfway through, leaning back in his chair with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. His posture, casual but calculated, his words designed to undercut her. "Cute effort, Nia, but let's leave the big ideas to the pros," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, expecting laughter. A ripple of agreement from the room to reinforce his authority, to remind everyone who was in charge, who controlled the narrative. They didn't laugh, their faces impassive, their eyes shifting to Nia, who stood unflinched. Her composure a wall he couldn't breach. Instead, she slid her notes aside, her movements deliberate, and said, "Of course. Mr. Caldwell, I'll let the data speak for itself." Her tone was neutral, but her eyes burned with something unspoken. A fire that made the room feel smaller, the air heavier, her words landing like a challenge disguised as compliance. A subtle rebuke that turned his attempt to diminish her into a moment that highlighted her strength, her intellect. They shifted in their seats, sensing the weight of her response. The way it reframed the moment, the way it exposed his bluster for what it was. He laughed, but it was forced, his confidence cracking just a fraction, his fingers tapping nervously on the table, his grin faltering as he realized the room wasn't with him, that his audience was slipping away. The turning point came on Friday, a day that would shift everything, a day that would expose the fault lines in Ethan's carefully constructed empire, revealing the fragility beneath his bravado, the cracks that had been forming all along. Apex was hosting a major investor meeting, a make-or-break moment for a $200 million funding round that could catapult the company into the big leagues, securing its place among the tech giants. A deal that Ethan had staked his reputation on, his legacy tied to its success. The conference room was a sea of polished suits from New York and London, their faces serious, their briefcases stuffed with expectations, their questions sharp and unrelenting, each one a test of Apex's worth, of Ethan's leadership, of the vision he'd sold them on. He was in his element, schmoozing with a charisma that bordered on desperation. His voice loud, his gestures expansive, his pitch polished to a shine, every word rehearsed to dazzle, to distract from the weaknesses he hoped they wouldn't see. Nia was there, tasked with handing out folders and taking notes, her presence almost invisible to the high-powered guests, or so they thought. Their eyes passing over her as just another intern, just another body in the room. She moved quietly, her steps measured, her expression focused as she organized documents, handed out agendas, and jotted down key points. Her pen moving with the same precision she brought to every task, her focus unwavering despite the chaos around her. He saw her across the room, standing near the projector, her blazer crisp, her curls catching the light as she sorted a stack of papers, her focus a quiet rebuke to the frenetic energy of the meeting. Sensing an audience, he called out, his voice loud and performative, cutting through the low hum of pre-meeting chatter like a spotlight finding its mark, drawing every eye in the room. "Nia, looking sharp. Come keep us company after this." "Yeah." His tone was flirtatious, dripping with arrogance, meant to impress the room with his dominance, to remind everyone that he was the one in control, that he could say whatever he wanted and get away with it. His words a power move designed to put her in her place in front of the most important people in the room, to show that he could toy with her without consequence. She didn't miss a beat. didn't hesitate for even a fraction of a second, her composure as solid as steel. Her presence a quiet force that refused to be diminished. "I'm here for work, Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the tension like a blade. Sharp and precise, each word landing with surgical accuracy. Slicing through his bravado, "But I'm happy to discuss the funding terms if you'd like." The room went silent, the kind of silence that feels like it's holding its breath. Every eye on her, every ear straining to catch what came next. The air charged with anticipation, heavy with the weight of the moment. He laughed, trying to play it off, but his face reddened, a flush creeping up his neck, his grin slipping into something closer to a grimace. "Hey." His eyes betraying a flicker of panic, a crack in his armor. "Feisty," he muttered, turning to the investors with a forced chuckle, trying to reclaim the moment, to turn it into a joke they'd all share. To pull the room back to his side. "She's got spirit." They didn't smile. Their faces impassive, their eyes shifting to Naya, who stood calm and unruffled. Her posture straight, her expression unreadable. Her presence commanding despite her silence. One man, older, with a sharp gaze and a navy suit that spoke of understated wealth, watched her closely, his expression intense but unreadable. His fingers resting lightly on the table, his presence commanding in a way that dwarfed Ethan's bluster. A quiet authority that needed no volume to assert itself. He hadn't spoken much, but his silence carried weight, like a storm cloud waiting to break, heavy with unspoken power. They moved on, but the mood had shifted. The air charged with something new, something inevitable. The balance of power tilting in ways Ethan couldn't see. His control slipping through his fingers like sand. His charm faltered, his jokes landing flat. His pitch sounding hollow as the meeting progressed. His voice growing louder as if volume could compensate for the cracks forming in his facade. His gestures increasingly frantic, his confidence fraying at the edges. Nia, still composed, handed out documents. Her every move deliberate, her eyes catching the older man's for a brief, almost imperceptible moment, a silent exchange that carried more weight than words. A connection that hinted at something deeper. He gave her a slight nod, a gesture so subtle it could have been missed, but it sent a ripple through the room, a signal that something was shifting, that the ground was moving beneath them. Ethan didn't notice, too busy pitching his vision for Apex. His voice loud, but increasingly unsteady, his gestures a little too wild, his carefully curated image unraveling with each passing moment. But Priya did, her sharp eyes catching the exchange, her instincts kicking in. She leaned toward Marcus, her voice a whisper, barely audible over the hum of the projector, her words urgent. "Who is that guy? He's been watching Naya all day." Marcus shrugged, his eyes darting between Nia and the man in the navy suit, his brow furrowing as he tried to piece it together. But they both felt something was coming, something big, something that would append everything they thought they knew about this moment. He didn't see the signs, didn't notice the way the room was shifting around him, the way his control was slipping through his fingers like sand, grain by grain, each moment eroding his carefully constructed empire. Ethan barreled through the meeting, tossing out buzzwords like disruption and synergy, his usual playbook for dazzling investors. His voice loud, his smile wide, but increasingly strained. His hands gesturing wildly, as if he could will the room back to his side, as if he could force them to see the vision he was selling. But the older man, introduced earlier as Mr. Edward Langston, wasn't impressed, his presence a quiet counterpoint to Ethan's bluster. His calm, a stark contrast to the CEO's desperation. He sat at the head of the table, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp, cutting through Ethan's polished pitch like a knife through paper, exposing the weaknesses beneath the gloss, the flaws he'd hoped to hide with charm and bravado. He asked pointed questions about Apex's financials, questions about cash flow, retention rates, long-term scalability, and market risks that Ethan fumbled, his answers vague and overly optimistic, his voice faltering as he tried to pivot, to charm his way out of the scrutiny, to gloss over the gaps in his narrative. "Your projections seem ambitious," Langston said, his tone measured but cutting. Like a surgeon's scalpel slicing through pretense, each word precise and deliberate, leaving no room for evasion. Ethan laughed it off, but sweat beaded on his forehead. His tie suddenly too tight, his hands fidgeting with his pen, his fingers betraying the nerves he was trying to hide. The cracks in his confidence growing wider with each question. They watched, sensing his swagger unraveling as Langston pressed harder. His questions relentless, each one peeling back another layer of Ethan's carefully crafted narrative, revealing the shaky foundation beneath, the weaknesses he'd hoped to bury under buzzwords and bravado. Naya stayed quiet, taking notes at the edge of the room, her pen moving steadily across her notebook, her posture calm but alert. Her presence, a quiet anchor in the storm of the meeting, a steady force amid the chaos. But she was impossible to ignore, a quiet gravity that drew eyes even when she wasn't speaking, a sense that she was more than she seemed, that she held something back, something powerful, something that could change everything. When Langston pivoted to ask about Apex's diversity initiatives, a known weak spot for the company, a topic that had been brushed under the rug for years, glossed over in reports and ignored in boardrooms, and stumbled again. His voice a little too quick, a little too defensive, his eyes darting around the room for support that wasn't there. His smile forced as he tried to pivot away from the question. "We're working on it," he said, his words rushed, his tone betraying his discomfort. His eyes searching for an ally, a lifeline, anything to shift the focus. He glanced at Nia, trying to use her as a prop to salvage the moment, to deflect the scrutiny, to turn the question into an opportunity to regain control. "Got great talent like her, right? She's proof we're moving in the right direction," he said, his voice strained, his smile awkward, his words landing like a jab out of place. A reminder of his earlier comments, his earlier attempts to diminish her. She didn't react, her face a mask of calm, her pen still moving across her notebook, her composure unshaken, her silence louder than his words. But Langston's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting to her. A flicker of something curiosity, recognition, perhaps even respect crossing his face, his lips twitching slightly as if he saw something others didn't. "Interesting," he said, his voice low but deliberate, each word carrying weight. Like a judge weighing evidence, his tone hinting at a deeper understanding. "Tell me, Miss Carter, what's your take on Apex's culture?" They held their breath, the room suddenly electric with anticipation. Every eye on Nia, every ear straining to hear her response. The air thick with the weight of the moment, the tension palpable, like a storm about to break. Ethan's smile froze, his fingers twitching against the table, his jaw tightening as he realized he was losing control, that the spotlight was slipping away from him, that the narrative was no longer his to shape. Nia set down her pen, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was choosing her moment, like she'd been waiting for this exact opportunity. Her eyes steady as they met Langston's, her posture unyielding, her presence commanding despite her silence. "Apex has potential," she said, her voice clear and steady, each word carefully chosen, resonating with a quiet authority that filled the room, commanding attention without demanding it, a voice that carried the weight of truth. "It's got the resources, the tech, the vision to be a leader in the industry. The foundation is there, the raw material to build something great, something lasting. But potential means nothing if the environment doesn't foster respect, if it doesn't value the people who drive the work, who bring the ideas to life. Talent leaves when it's not seen, when it's dismissed, undermined, or treated as a prop instead of a partner. A company can't grow if it's choking its own roots, if it's stifling the very people it needs to thrive." The words were diplomatic, professional, but razor-sharp, cutting straight to the heart of the room, exposing the cracks in Apex's culture that everyone knew existed but no one dared to name, the unspoken truths that lingered in the break-room whispers, in the sidelong glances, in the quiet frustrations of those who felt unseen, undervalued, pushed aside. Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes darting to the investors. hoping for a lifeline, a nod, a smile, anything to pull him out of the hole he'd dug, to restore his grip on the narrative, to bring the room back to his side. They didn't offer one, their faces impassive, their eyes fixed on Nia, who sat calm and composed. Her words still echoing in the silence, their weight settling over the room like a fog. Langston nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips, his eyes locked on her. A spark of something like pride in his gaze, a recognition that went beyond the moment. "Well said," he replied, his tone warm but weighted with something deeper, something that made the room feel smaller, the stakes higher, the air heavier with the promise of change. "I'd expect nothing less." He, Ethan, tried to steer the conversation back, launching into a spiel about Apex's growth metrics. His voice louder now, almost desperate, as if he could drown out the moment with sheer volume. As if he could reclaim the room with buzzwords and bravado, with the force of his personality. But the damage was done, the balance of power shifting in ways he couldn't grasp. The ground moving beneath his feet, his control slipping away like water through his fingers. Langston's focus had shifted entirely to Nia, his questions now directed at her, his demeanor one of quiet respect. A stark contrast to Ethan's increasingly frantic energy. His voice growing shrill, his gestures erratic. "Ms. Carter, you've analyzed the market data for this deal, correct?" he asked, leaning forward slightly, his hands folded on the table, his eyes sharp and attentive. His posture one of genuine interest. She nodded, pulling out a tablet from her bag. Her movements calm but purposeful, like she'd been preparing for this moment all along, like she'd known it was coming, her confidence a quiet force that filled the space. "Yes, sir. I noticed some discrepancies in the growth projections," she said, her voice steady, her fingers tapping the screen to bring up her analysis, her eyes scanning the data with the precision of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. She launched into a breakdown, crisp, data-driven, methodical, exposing flaws in Ethan's pitch that he'd glossed over with buzzwords and charm. Flaws that could have derailed the deal if left unchecked. Mistakes that spoke to a lack of rigor, a reliance on flash over substance. She pointed out inflated revenue forecasts, gaps in customer retention data, risks in the competitive landscape, and missed opportunities in emerging markets. Her voice steady and authoritative, her analysis leaving no room for argument. Each point landing like a perfectly aimed dart, precise and undeniable. They stared, stunned, their pens frozen over their notebooks, their eyes darting between Nia and Ethan, who sat rigid, his face a mask of forced calm, his hands clenched under the table, his knuckles white, his composure fraying at the edges. Priya whispered to Marcus, her voice barely audible over the hum of the projector. Her eyes wide with realization, her breath catching as she processed what was unfolding. "She's not just an intern." Marcus nodded, his breath catching, his gaze fixed on Nia, his mind racing to keep up with the shift in the room. "No way she's just an intern." The room buzzed with tension, a current running through every glance. Every shifted posture, every held breath, the air thick with the weight of what was unfolding. The sense that something monumental was happening. Ethan's face was a mask, but his composure was fraying at the edges. His hands betraying his nerves, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. A way to regain control, to pull the narrative back to his side. Langston listened to Nia, nodding as she spoke. His expression one of quiet approval, his eyes bright with something that looked like pride. A recognition that went beyond the moment, a sense that he saw something in her that others had missed. When she finished, he leaned back, his fingers steepled, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the room, each word deliberate and resonant, filling the space with an authority that dwarfed Ethan's fading bravado. "Impressive," he said, his tone measured but powerful, a statement that carried the weight of judgment. "You've got a sharp mind, Ms. Carter, and an eye for what matters. For the details that make or break a deal." Then he turned to Ethan, his tone colder now, cutting through the air like a blade, sharp and unyielding, his eyes narrowing as he delivered the blow. "Why wasn't this analysis in the main presentation? Why am I hearing this from an intern instead of the CEO?" Ethan stammered, his usual confidence crumbling, his words tripping over themselves. his voice faltering as he tried to regain control, to find an answer that would satisfy, that would restore his authority. "She's just an intern," Langston cut him off. His voice sharp, his eyes narrowing, his tone leaving no room for excuses. "Clearly, she's more than that." They didn't know it yet, but the ground was shifting. The balance of power tilting in ways no one could have predicted. Least of all Ethan, who sat frozen, his world unraveling with each passing second, his empire trembling under the weight of his own missteps. After the meeting, Langston lingered, speaking quietly to Nia near the conference room door. Their conversation low but intense, their words too soft for others to catch in full, but carrying a weight that was impossible to ignore, a sense of purpose that filled the space between them. Ethan watched from across the room, his unease growing, his fingers drumming nervously on his folder, his eyes darting between Nia and Langston, his mind racing to make sense of what was happening, to understand why the room felt so different, why his control was slipping away. Priya and Marcus overheard snippets as they packed up their notes, Langston mentioning due diligence, leadership, and future opportunities, his tone serious but warm, like he was speaking to someone he respected, someone he trusted, someone he saw as more than just a face in the room, more than just an intern. Nia nodded, her expression unreadable, her responses brief but confident, her posture straight and unyielding, her presence commanding despite her silence, her calm a stark contrast to the chaos around her. When Langston left, he handed her a card, his voice low but firm, his eyes locking with hers in a moment that felt heavy with meaning, a moment that carried the promise of something bigger. "Call me," he said, a weight to his words that suggested more than a casual offer, a door opening to a world beyond Apex, a world where her talent would be recognized, not diminished. She took the card, slipping it into her pocket with a nod, her face giving nothing away, her composure as steady as ever, silence louder than any words. Ethan tried to laugh it off, sauntering over with a forced grin, his voice louder than necessary, his bravado a thin veil over his growing panic. His attempt to reassert control, desperate and transparent. "Networking already, Nia." "Don't get too big for your boots," he said, his tone light, but laced with an edge, a desperate attempt to pull her back into his orbit, to remind her of her place. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes, cold edge to her expression that sent a chill through the room. A quiet defiance that cut deeper than words, a warning he was too arrogant to heed. "I know my place, Mr. Caldwell," she said. Her voice soft but laced with steel, each word a quiet challenge, a promise of consequences he didn't yet understand. A hint of the storm that was coming. He found out the truth that evening, and it hit like a freight train, shattering his world in a way he couldn't have seen coming. A blow that left him reeling, his empire crumbling around him, his carefully constructed facade collapsing under the weight of reality. Ethan was in his corner office, sipping whiskey, the city skyline glittering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a view that usually made him feel untouchable, like a king surveying his domain. The lights of Chicago, a testament to his success, his power. He was replaying the meeting in his head, trying to convince himself he'd salvaged it, that his charm had won them over despite the rocky moments, despite the way Langston's questions had exposed his weaknesses, despite the way Nia had stolen the room without even trying. Her presence a quiet force that had shifted the narrative out of his control. His phone buzzed with messages he ignored, his inbox filling with emails he didn't want to read, his mind racing to hold on to the narrative he'd built, to convince himself that he was still in charge. His CFO, Greg, burst in, his face pale, his tie loosened like he'd been running, his breath uneven as he leaned against the desk, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge, his eyes wide with something close to panic. "You know who Nia Carter is?" he asked, his voice shaking, his words tumbling out in a rush, his urgency cutting through the haze of Ethan's denial. Ethan frowned, swirling his glass, his brow furrowing, his mind slow to catch up, his irritation rising at the interruption. "The intern," he said, his voice tinged with annoyance, as if the question was an inconvenience, a distraction from his brooding, a challenge to his authority. Greg shook his head, his eyes darting around the room, his voice dropping to a whisper as if saying it out loud would make it more real, would make the consequences more immediate. "She's Edward Langston's daughter." Ethan's glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the hardwood floor, the whiskey pooling like blood. The sound echoing in the silent office, a sharp, jarring note that mirrored the shock coursing through him. The realization hitting like a physical blow. They had all missed it. Nia wasn't just an intern, not just a bright-eyed NYU grad with a knack for data, not just a quiet presence in the background. She was the daughter of Edward Langston, Apex's biggest potential investor, a billionaire whose name carried weight in boardrooms across the globe, a man whose influence could make or break the company with a single phone call. A single word, a single decision, his power, a quiet force that needed no flash to assert itself. She had played her role perfectly, letting Ethan dig his own grave with every smirk, every condescending comment, every flirtatious jab that he thought was harmless. A way to flex his power, to show off in front of his team, his investors, his world, to remind everyone that he was untouchable. He had underestimated her, mocked her, flirted with her to assert his dominance, thinking she was powerless, just another intern to push around, someone who would bend under the weight of his authority, who would play along with his game, who would fit neatly into the script he'd written. They watched it unfold over the next few days, the fallout swift and merciless, a cascade of consequences that hit like a tidal wave, sweeping away everything he'd built. Langston pulled his funding interest, citing cultural concerns in a curt email that sent the office into chaos. The words landing like a death knell for Apex's ambitions, each syllable a nail in the coffin of Ethan's dreams. A condemnation of his leadership, his behavior, his arrogance. Whispers of his behavior spread like wildfire, first through the company, then to industry circles. His reputation tanking faster than he could spin it, his carefully crafted image crumbling under the weight of his own actions, his own hubris. Stories of his comments to Nia, his dismissive attitude, his inappropriate remarks began to circulate, shared in hushed tones at industry events, in emails between executives, in posts on anonymous forums where insiders spilled the tea. Each story a thread in the unraveling of his legacy. His phone rang with calls from investors pulling out, their voices cold and final. His inbox flooded with questions he couldn't answer, demands for explanations he couldn't provide. His carefully built empire wobbling on its foundation, threatening to collapse under the weight of his mistakes. Each one, a brick he'd laid himself. Nia, meanwhile, was offered a role at Langston's firm, a position that matched her talent, her sharp mind finally recognized. Her potential no longer confined to coffee runs and filing. No longer buried under the weight of someone else's ego, no longer diminished by a culture that valued flash over substance. She didn't gloat, didn't need to, didn't waste her energy on theatrics or petty triumphs. Her victory was quiet, deliberate, devastating. A masterclass in letting someone's arrogance destroy them, in letting their own actions be their undoing, in wielding intelligence and grace as weapons sharper than any outburst. She had walked into Apex as an intern, her true identity hidden, her power understated, and she had let Ethan underestimate her, let him build the noose with his own words, his own actions, his own need to dominate. She had watched as he tied it, as he slipped it around his own neck, as he pulled it tight with every smirk, every jab, every moment he thought he was in control, every moment he thought he could diminish her without consequence. They watched her leave, her head high, her steps steady, her future bright while Ethan's crumbled. Her card from Langston tucked safely in her pocket, a symbol of the opportunities that awaited her, of the world that was opening up to her now that she'd shown who she truly was, now that she'd stepped out of the shadows and into her own power. They say justice comes quietly, but it hits hard, like a wave that builds slowly, gathering strength beneath the surface, only to crash with unstoppable force, reshaping everything in its path, leaving nothing unchanged. Nia didn't need to shout or make a scene, didn't need to raise her voice or throw a punch. She let Ethan's arrogance do all the work, let his own actions unravel everything he'd built. His empire wobbling as investors pulled out, As his phone rang with calls, he couldn't answer. As his inbox flooded with questions, he couldn't deflect. Each one a reminder of his failure, a testament to his downfall. She walked away, her head high, her future bright, her steps steady as she left Apex behind, leaving Ethan to grapple with the wreckage of his own making, to face the consequences of his own hubris. What would you do if you were Naya, facing someone who underestimated you at every turn, who thought their power gave them the right to diminish you, to push you down to lift themselves up? Have you ever dealt with an Ethan? Someone who thought they could control the narrative, only to find themselves undone by their own arrogance? Their own inability to see the strength in others? Drop your story in the comments. Let's talk about what it means to stand tall when the world expects you to shrink, to fight back with intelligence and grace instead of anger, to let the truth be your weapon, to let it speak louder than any shout. Like, subscribe, and share if you believe in justice that doesn't just speak, but roars. A justice that reminds us all that the quietest storms are often the most powerful. The ones that leave the deepest mark. The ones that change everything.